The air in Gaon, Seoul's most exclusive private restaurant, smelled of power. It was a layered scent, premium scotch, the sweet char of galbi sizzling over oak charcoal, and the clean metallic tang of money so old it had forgotten how to be loud. For Zora, standing perfectly still by the polished mahogany service station, it mostly smelled like survival. Her uniform was a crisp black sheath dress, a marker of her class in a room where class was everything. It was just a little too tight across the shoulders, a constant reminder that she didn't quite fit. Her hair, a crown of intricate box braids, was pulled back into a severe, elegant bun at the nape of her neck. Her hands, holding a silver tray, were steady. They had to be. Her dark eyes, watchful and intelligent, missed nothing. The subtle shift in a bodyguard's stance, the way a wife's smile didn't reach her eyes, the tremor in the manager's hand as he refilled a water glass. This world of quiet transactions and veiled threats was a universe away from the one she was fighting for. A small, sunlit room in a hospice across the city, where her grandmother, her Hall Meoni, was battling a cancer that required a treatment with a name as long as its price tag. 27 million won for the first round, a figure so vast it felt like a mountain she had to dismantle with a teaspoon. Each shift, each polite nod, each swallowed insult was a spoonful of dirt removed. It wasn't weakness that kept her here, bowing her head to Seoul's elite. It was sacrifice. Mr. Park, the floor manager, scurried past, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Mrs. Yu, table 7, she's early," he whispered, his voice tight with panic. A ripple of fear went through the staff. It was a familiar current, one that always followed the name Yu. Zora's posture, already ramrod straight, seemed to gain an invisible millimeter of steel. She didn't flinch. She simply registered the information. Mrs. Yu was the wife of Yu Tai-woo, a construction magnate whose ambition was matched only by his vulgarity. They were new money, desperate to carve a space in the old money world of Gaon, and they did it with cruelty, mistaking it for strength. Zora had been something else once. Before the hospice bills, before the crushing weight of responsibility. She had been a student of international policy at Yonsei University, her tuition paid for by a man she called a Baoji, father. A man who had taken her in when she was an orphaned girl, a black American child lost in the labyrinth of Seoul after her diplomat parents were killed. He had been a powerful man, a chairman of a different sort of enterprise. He had taught her that dignity was a weapon, that silence was a language, and that understanding your enemy's tongue was the first step to dismantling his house. But he was gone now, and his world had fractured. She was on her own. The knowledge, the language, the training, it was all still there, a coiled serpent sleeping inside her. Here, she was just a waitress, invisible. It was safer that way. In the corner, at a small shadowed table, sat the restaurant's owner, Kwon Min-jun. He was a constant silent presence, part of the restaurant's expensive decor. He never spoke to the staff, rarely ate, and simply watched. He moved with a predatory grace, his body encased in a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed a part of his skin. On his wrist was a Patek Philippe watch, a piece of machinery that could fund Halmeoni's treatment for a year. His dark hair was impeccably styled, but it was his eyes that held the room hostage. They were cold, calculating, and missed nothing. He was the son of her Abeoji, the man who had inherited the empire, her brother in all but blood. He did not acknowledge her, and she did not acknowledge him. It was a silent, necessary arrangement. She needed to do this herself. Mrs. Yu arrived in a cloud of expensive perfume and entitlement. She was flanked by 2 other women, their faces tight with surgery and condescension. They surveyed the room as if it were a territory to be conquered. Mrs. Yu's eyes, small and sharp, landed on Zora. A slow, cruel smile spread across her lips. It was the smile of a predator who had found its favorite prey. "You!" Mrs. Yu's voice cut through the quiet hum of the restaurant. "Water. Now." Zora inclined her head. "Yes, ma'am." Her voice was a low, deferential murmur. She moved with practiced efficiency, her steps silent on the dark wood floor. She placed the crystal glasses down, her movements fluid and precise. The humiliation began subtly, a dismissive wave of the hand, comments made in rapid-fire Korean, laced with casual racism, all predicated on the assumption that Zora couldn't understand a word. "Look at her. They'll let anyone work here now, one of the friends tittered. Her hair, Mrs. Yu said, her voice dripping with disdain. It's like wire, so unseemly. Zora's face remained a neutral mask. Inside, the serpent stirred. She focused on the number, 27,000,001. She could endure this. She had to. The main courses arrived, a bubbling pot of hemul jjigae, a fiery seafood stew, its steam carrying the rich scent of gochujang and brine. Zora placed it carefully in the center of the table. Mrs. Yu watched her, a glint in her eye. As Zora straightened up, Mrs. Yu's hand shot out, accidentally knocking the heavy ceramic bowl. The scalding red liquid cascaded forward, directly onto Zora's forearm. Pain, white-hot and blinding, lanced up her arm. She didn't cry out. She didn't even flinch. A gasp went through the nearby tables. Mr. Park rushed forward, babbling apologies. "Oh my goodness!" Mrs. Yu feigned shock, her performance flawless. "So clumsy. You should be more careful." She looked at Zora's arm, where the skin was already blistering, with a look of profound satisfaction. Zora stood perfectly still. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. She could feel the eyes on her, the pity, the morbid curiosity. In the corner, Kwon Min-jun had not moved, but his stillness had changed. It was no longer passive. It was absolute, dangerous. "I apologize, ma'am." Zora's voice was a low whisper, strained with the effort of controlling the agony in her arm. "It was my fault." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, but it was a necessary one. She needed this job. Halmione needed her. "Clean it up," Mrs. Yu commanded, dismissing her with a flick of her wrist. "And get me another stew." Zora retreated to the staff area, her arms screaming in protest. She ran cold water over the burn, her teeth clenched against a wave of nausea. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The pain from the burn was nothing compared to the searing humiliation. She was a ghost, a non-entity, a thing upon which others could inflict their casual cruelty without consequence. She finished her shift, the pain a dull, throbbing companion. She wrapped her arm tightly, hiding the angry red welts beneath the sleeve of her coat. As she stepped out into the cold Seoul night, heading towards the employee parking lot, a voice called out behind her. "Wait!" It was Mrs. Yu. She stood there, her friends flanking her like vultures. The performance was not yet over. The public humiliation hadn't been enough. She needed a final, private act of dominance. "I don't think you were sufficiently sorry," Mrs. Yu said, stepping closer. The air was frigid, and Zora's breath plumed in front of her. "I assure you, ma'am, I am." Zora kept her voice even, her eyes fixed on a point over Mrs. Yu's shoulder. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," Mrs. Yu snapped. Her voice was no longer performative. It was sharp, ugly. "You think because you work in a fancy place, you're better than what you are? A dirty foreigner." Zora remained silent. Her dignity was the only armor she had left. And then Mrs. Yu reached out. Her manicured fingers, cold and sharp, tangled in Zora's braids, yanking her head back with a vicious tug. Pain exploded at her scalp. "I said, look at me." Mrs. Yu's face was inches from hers, her breath smelling of wine and malice. "This hair, disgusting. Do you know who my husband is? He could have you deported with a single phone call. You would be nothing." The world narrowed to the tearing pain at her roots, the sneering face before her, the giggles of the other women. 27,000,001, Halmeone's face, pale and smiling. Abeoji's voice. "Dignity is a weapon, little bird. Never let them take it." Something inside Zora snapped. It wasn't a loud crack, but a quiet seismic shift. The deference, the carefully constructed invisibility, the mask of the subservient waitress, it all fell away, shattering into a million pieces on the cold asphalt of the parking lot. For 3 seconds, she said nothing. 3 seconds where the pain in her scalp became a focusing point. 3 seconds where she weighed survival against self-respect. 3 seconds where she decided she was done. Her body, which had been held in a posture of tense submission, went utterly still. The stillness of a predator that has just spotted its kill. Her eyes, which had been downcast, lifted to meet Mrs. Yu's. They were no longer the eyes of a waitress. They were ancient and cold and filled with a language Mrs. Yu had never learned. A slow, chilling smile touched Zora's lips. It was a terrifying sight. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was a deadly quiet, a silken thread of sound that cut through the frigid air with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, and it was in perfect fluent Korean. Not the polite standard Seoul dialect she used with customers. This was the rough, guttural Saturi of Busan, the dialect of dock workers, fishermen, and gangsters, the language of the organization her abeoji had built. Sonde, Ajuma. The words were ice. Take your hand off, lady. Mrs. Yu froze. The shock was so profound it was almost comical. Her hand was still tangled in Zora's hair, but the triumphant smirk had vanished from her face, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. Her friends' giggling died in their throats. Zora didn't move. She let the silence stretch, letting the woman's entire worldview crumble around her. The black waitress, the invisible foreigner, the clumsy servant, spoke Korean. Not just spoke it, but wielded it like a blade. Ne meori karajeso, jigum. Zora's voice dropped even lower, the command absolute. From my hair, now. Mrs. Yu's hand recoiled as if burned. She stumbled back a step, her eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, sickening fear. Who was this woman? Zora straightened to her full height, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. The physical transformation was breathtaking. She was no longer a servant cowering in a parking lot. She was a queen holding court. You talk a lot about your husband's power, you Simonim, Zora continued, her Busan dialect flawless, each syllable dripping with contempt. She used the formal title for a gangster's wife, turning it into an insult. But a powerful man's wife shouldn't have to gossip so loudly about his illegal stock purchases in a public restaurant, especially the ones involving Phoenix Development. The SEC might find that very interesting. The color drained from Mrs. Yu's face. She looked as if she'd been struck. The casual, cruel words she'd used inside were nothing compared to this surgical strike. Zora had not only understood everything, she had been listening, analyzing, and waiting. Who are you? Mrs. Yu stammered, the last of her bravado evaporating into the cold night air. Before Zora could answer, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the parking lot. A long, black sedan had been idling there, its engine a low purr, its tinted windows hiding its occupant. Now, the driver's door opened. Kwon Min-jun emerged. He moved with an unhurried, lethal grace. The ambient light of the parking lot seemed to bend around him, swallowed by the perfect black wool of his overcoat. He wasn't looking at Mrs. Yu. His cold, unreadable eyes were fixed on Zora. There was no surprise in them, only a deep, unnerving stillness. It was the look of a man seeing something he had long suspected finally come to the surface. He stopped beside Zora, a silent, imposing wall of power. He still didn't look at Mrs. Yu. He examined the face of his Patek Philippe watch as if she were a minor inconvenience, a delay in his schedule. Mrs. Yu, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. It was the sound of a tomb door closing. My father had a rule. The families of our associates are to be treated with respect, always. He paused, finally letting his gaze drift to her. The sheer glacial coldness in his eyes made her physically recoil. But you are not family, he stated. It wasn't an insult. It was a simple, devastating fact. And this woman, he gestured almost imperceptibly toward Zora, is. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a universe reordering itself. Mrs. Yu stared, her mind unable to process the information. The waitress was family to Kwon Min-jun, the head of the Golden Dragon Syndicate? It was impossible. Your husband will be hearing from me, Min-jun said, his tone conversational, which made it all the more terrifying. I suggest you go home. It was not a suggestion. It was an execution order. Mrs. Yu, trembling, practically scrambled to her car, her friends scurrying after her like frightened mice. The parking lot was silent again, save for the hum of the sedan. Min-jun turned his full attention to Zora, the coldness in his eyes softened by a fraction, replaced by something complex and unreadable. He looked at her burned arm, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Get in the car, Zora. he said, his voice now low and rough with an emotion he refused to name. It was an order, but it felt like a plea. He didn't wait for an answer. He opened the back door of the sedan, holding it for her. For the first time in years, the invisible wall between them had crumbled. The game was over. Zora hesitated for only a moment. Then, leaving the ghost of the waitress behind on the cold asphalt, she got in. The interior of the car was silent and smelled of worn leather and Min-jun's subtle, expensive cologne. It was a world away from the restaurant. It was the world she had been born into a second time, the world she had tried to escape. Min-jun's driver, a mountain of a man with a scarred face, pulled away from the curb without a word. Min-jun sat beside her, the space between them charged with years of unspoken history. He didn't speak, but reached into a compartment and produced a state-of-the-art medical kit. His movements were deft and surprisingly gentle as he took her injured arm. He unwrapped the cheap bandage she'd used, his expression hardening as he saw the raw, blistered skin. He cleaned the wound with an antiseptic wipe, his touch firm but careful. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. This was their language, not words, action, protection. "You should have told me you were here," he finally said, his voice low. He wasn't looking at her, but at his work, applying a burn salve with a sterile applicator. "I had to do it myself, Min-jun," Zora replied, her own voice steady. The formal appa she would have used as a child was gone. They were adults now, equals in a way they had never been before. "The money for Halmione, I couldn't take it from the family, not as a gift." "It would not have been a gift," he countered, his voice flat. "It is your birthright. Abaoji considered you his daughter." "And what would everyone else have considered me?" she challenged, her gaze sharp. "A charity case, a pet, the black girl the old boss took pity on. I needed to earn my place, or at least earn the money for her treatment on my own terms." He finished wrapping her arm in a clean white bandage, his work neat and professional. He leaned back against the leather seat, the tension in the car so thick it was almost suffocating. "And what are your terms now?" he asked, his eyes finally meeting hers. In their dark depths, she saw the weight of the empire he carried, the loneliness of command. This was the negotiation, the moment where their new relationship would be forged. He was offering her a place at his side, a return to the fold, but she would not come back as a ward or a charity case. She would come back as a partner, an asset. "Yu Tae-woo is laundering money through Phoenix Development," she stated, her voice crisp and analytical. The waitress was gone, replaced by the Yonsei policy student, the strategist Abaoji had trained. "He's using substandard materials on government contracts and pocketing the difference. He uses a series of shell corporations based in the Cayman Islands to hide the profits. His wife was foolish enough to name one of them tonight." Min-jun's expression didn't change, but a dangerous light flickered in his eyes. He was seeing her for the first time, not as the little sister he had to protect, but as a weapon he could deploy. "I want him ruined," Zora said, her voice cold as steel. "Not just hurt, not just punished. I want his name erased, his money gone, his reputation shattered. I want him to lose everything, and I want to be the one to do it." Min-jun was silent for a long moment, studying her face. He was assessing her, weighing her resolve. He had the resources, the muscle, the network, but she had something he didn't. She had been on the inside, on the ground floor. She had seen the world from below, and from that vantage point, you could see the cracks in the foundation that were invisible from the penthouse. "I will give you whatever you need," he said. It was not a promise of rescue. It was an investment, a trade, his resources for her expertise. "Our resources are your resources." "Good," Zora said, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over her. "Because Mrs. Yu was wrong about one thing." Min-jun raised an eyebrow. "She said her husband could have me deported," Zora explained, a flicker of dark humor in her eyes. "But as of last year, I hold dual citizenship. Abaoji arranged it before he passed. He always said it was important to have a home to come back to." A rare, almost imperceptible smile touched Min-jun's lips. It was a sliver of warmth in the cold expanse of his control. He was a wise man. The war began quietly. Yu Tae-woo's first move was clumsy, a brute force attack. He tried to have Zora fired, calling Mr. Park and threatening him. The call was routed to Min-jun's desk. The conversation was brief. Mr. Park was no longer the manager of GAN. Yu Tai Wu was no longer welcome there. A small victory, but a clear message. Next, Yu tried to frame her. A bag of narcotics was planted in her apartment locker. But Minjun's people were already there. The men who planted it were intercepted, questioned, and sent back to their boss with broken fingers and a message of their own. The escalation had begun. Zora moved into a secure penthouse apartment in a building owned by the Golden Dragon Syndicate. It was a gilded cage, but a necessary one. From there, she began her work. Minjun gave her access to the Syndicate's intelligence network, a vast web of information and surveillance. But Zora knew that technology and informants could only get you so far. The real secrets were hidden in plain sight, in the mundane world she had just left. She started her own investigation, using the skills Abaoji had taught her. She wasn't just a strategist, she was an operative. One evening, dressed in the simple, neat attire of a hotel housekeeper, she slipped into the Grand Majestic, a 5-star hotel owned by Yu Tai Wu. Her ID was a flawless forgery, courtesy of Minjun's network, but the rest was all her. The way she walked, head down, avoiding eye contact. The way she handled the cleaning cart, a prop she used to navigate the service corridors. She knew the rhythm of these places, the blind spots in their security, the tired gossip of the staff. She had been invisible for a year, and now she weaponized that invisibility. This was her solo operation. Minjun knew the target, but not the method. He had offered a team. She had refused. This was something she had to do alone. She made her way to the executive offices, her heart pounding a steady, controlled rhythm. She accessed the office of Yu's chief financial officer, using a simple magnetic lockpick. Inside, she didn't touch the main computer. Too obvious. Instead, she targeted a secondary tablet, one he used for personal correspondence. She attached a small device to its charging port, a data skimmer that would clone its contents in minutes. While it worked, she emptied the trash, wiped down the desk, and straightened a picture frame. The perfect housekeeper, leaving no trace. Back in her penthouse, she analyzed the data. It was a goldmine: emails, encrypted messages, bank transfers. Yu wasn't just laundering money. He was involved in something far darker. His construction sites, particularly the ones in rural areas, were being used as waypoints for human trafficking, moving desperate people from Southeast Asia into a life of forced labor. The substandard materials weren't just about profit. They were about building structures that were designed to be temporary, untraceable. The cold fury that filled her was absolute. This was no longer about a personal insult. It was about justice. As she dug deeper, the threat escalated. One afternoon, Minjun received a call. One of Yu's lieutenants had been seen near Halmioni's hospice. It was a line that should never have been crossed. A sacred rule of their world had been broken. Minjun's immediate reaction was explosive violence. "I'll send a team. We'll burn his entire operation to the ground tonight," he snarled, his control finally cracking. "No!" Zora's voice cut through his rage, sharp and clear. He turned to her, his eyes blazing. "They threatened Halmioni. They threatened our family." "And a direct attack is what he wants," she countered, her calm a stark contrast to his fury. "It will be messy, bloody, and it will make him a martyr to his people. It will bring the police down on both of us. We don't burn his house down, Minjun. We evict him. We take the foundation out from under it so it collapses on its own." This was the moment, the test. He was the boss, the head of the syndicate. His word was law. But she was challenging his plan, his authority. She was not his subordinate. She was his partner. He stared at her, the internal battle visible on his face. His instinct screamed for retribution. But his intellect, the cold, calculating mind of a leader, recognized the truth in her words. Her strategy was cleaner, more permanent, more devastating. He was a hammer, but this problem required a scalpel. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. "What's your plan?" he asked. He was deferring to her. In their world, it was the ultimate sign of respect. "First, we move Halmioni," Zora said, already taking charge. "But not to one of your safe houses. He'll expect that. We move her somewhere only we would know." An hour later, Zora was supervising the quiet, discreet transfer of her grandmother. Halmioni, frail but with a fire in her eyes, was moved to a small, secluded house in the mountains outside Seoul. It was the house where Abeoji had first taken Zora, the place where he had taught her to read and write in Korean, the place she first called home. It was off every grid, protected by old loyalties, not new technology. As Zora tucked her grandmother into bed, Halmione clasped her hand. "You have his eyes, child," she whispered in Korean. "The old chairman, when you've made up your mind, be careful." "I will, Halmione," Zora promised, kissing her forehead. "I'm just finishing something Abeoji started." With her grandmother safe, Zora initiated the second phase of her plan. She compiled the data from the CFO's tablet, cross-referencing it with the syndicate's intelligence. She built a flawless, undeniable case. A digital paper trail that led from the trafficked victims to the shell corporations to Yu Tai-woo's personal accounts. While she worked, Min Jun's protection became a quiet, constant presence. One evening, as she was leaving a late meeting, two men tried to corner her in a parking garage. Before they could get within 10 feet, they were intercepted by two of Min Jun's guards who seemed to materialize from the shadows. The confrontation was brutal and silent. Zora didn't even break her stride. She heard a dull thud, a choked cry, and nothing more. When she reached her car, one of the guards was waiting. He simply opened her door and nodded, protection as a love language. But the protection flowed both ways. A week later, Zora's analysis uncovered a critical threat not to her, but to Min Jun. Yu, growing desperate, had hired a team of foreign assassins to hit Min Jun at a public event. His security team was focused on the obvious threats: snipers, car bombs, direct assault. But Zora, using her knowledge of service logistics, saw a different vulnerability: the catering staff. She flagged it, but Min Jun's security chief, an older man loyal to his father, was dismissive. "We vet everyone, Miss Zora. They're clear." "You vet their identities, not their allegiances," she argued. "Yu is paying them in cash. There's no record. They'll be posing as waiters." The security chief was unconvinced, but Min Jun listened. He watched her, his expression thoughtful. "Show me," he commanded. Zora laid out the blueprints of the hotel ballroom. "They'll come through here, the main service corridor. But your men are watching the entrances. The real threat is here." She pointed to a small, overlooked food elevator connecting the kitchen to a private pantry behind the main stage, where Min Jun was scheduled to give a speech. "They won't come at you from the front. They'll come from behind." On the night of the event, Min Jun's security was doubled, with a team placed exactly where Zora had indicated. Just as she predicted, two men dressed as waiters, carrying concealed weapons, emerged from the food elevator. They were apprehended before they could take a single step into the ballroom. They never even saw the men who took them down. Later that night, Min Jun found Zora on the balcony of her penthouse, looking out over the glittering expanse of Seoul. He stood beside her in silence for a long time. The city lights reflected in his dark eyes. "My security chief tendered his resignation," he said finally. "Don't accept it," Zora replied without looking at him. "He's loyal. He just has blind spots. We all do." "You don't seem to," he observed, his voice quiet. "Mine is my grandmother," she admitted. "That's why he targeted her. He knew." He nodded, a silent acknowledgement. "You saved my life tonight." "You saved mine last week," she countered. "I guess we're even." He turned to face her, the city lights painting sharp angles on his face. "This is not about being even, Zora. This is about family." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't offer it to her. He simply opened it. Inside was a pin. A small, exquisitely crafted golden dragon, its eyes tiny chips of jade. It was the symbol of their organization, worn only by the highest-ranking members of the inner circle, the one Abeoji used to wear on his lapel. "He wanted you to have this," Min Jun said. "He told me to give it to you when you were ready to claim your place, not when I thought you were ready." "When you were." Zora looked at the pin, then up at his face. This was more than an alliance. It was an anointing, an acceptance. It was the symbolic object transfer that signified her true return. She didn't take the box. She simply reached out and took the pin, her fingers brushing his. It was the first time they had touched since he had bandaged her arm. A current passed between them, a spark of shared history, shared purpose. "It's time to end this," she said, her voice firm. "My plan is ready." The final confrontation was not set in a boardroom or a back alley. Zora chose the stage with care. The grand opening of the new Liam Museum wing, the pinnacle of Seoul's high society. It was public, it was elegant, and it was the perfect place to watch an empire burn. Zora arrived not with Minjun, but on her own. She was no longer the invisible waitress in a tight black dress. She wore a bespoke, modern suit inspired by a traditional hanbok. The jacket was sharp and tailored, made of a deep indigo silk that seemed to drink the light, while the wide-legged trousers flowed with a liquid grace. Pinned to her lapel was the small golden dragon, its jade eyes glittering. Her braids were styled in an elegant updo that showcased the proud line of her neck. When she walked into the museum, heads turned. She was no longer a servant in this world. She was a player. Minjun was already there, a silent gravitational center in the swirling galaxy of Seoul's elite. He watched her enter, a flicker of something unreadable, pride, perhaps, in his cold eyes. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The trap was set. The Yus arrived late, a desperate attempt to project an aura of nonchalant power. Yu Tai-woo looked haggard, the strain of the past few weeks showing in the lines around his eyes. Mrs. Yu was a porcelain doll of anxiety, her smile brittle, her eyes darting around the room. She was looking for threats, but she didn't know what the real threat looked like. And then she saw her. She saw a striking, powerful black woman in a breathtaking suit, holding a glass of champagne, speaking quietly with the Minister of Finance. She saw the golden dragon pin. Her mind stuttered, unable to connect this vision of authority with the clumsy foreign waitress from the restaurant. Then Zora turned, and their eyes met across the crowded room. Recognition dawned, followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated horror. Mrs. Yu's face went white. The champagne glass trembled in her hand. This was the confrontation reversal mirror. The waitress from the parking lot was here, in her world, wearing a suit that cost more than her car, and she was wearing the dragon of the Kwan family. Zora's expression was serene. She gave a small, polite nod, the same gesture she had used as a waitress, but now it was imbued with a chilling authority. It was a gesture of dismissal. The first blow was silent. At precisely 9 p.m., a trusted contact at the Financial Supervisory Service received a data packet from a secure server. Simultaneously, a journalist at the nation's most respected investigative news outlet received the same packet. It contained everything: the trafficking, the money laundering, the shell corporations, the fraudulent contracts. The digital pincer Zora had designed was closing. The second blow was social. As Zora made her way through the crowd, she approached Yu Tai-woo, who was deep in conversation with a banking executive. "Mr. Yu," she said, her voice clear and calm. He turned, annoyed at the interruption, then froze as he recognized the woman his wife had been babbling about in a panic. "I believe you've been using a shell company called Azure Holdings for your Phoenix development projects," Zora said conversationally, her voice loud enough for the banker to hear. "Interesting choice. My analysts find their registration in the Caymans to be thin." The banker's eyes widened. He excused himself immediately, pulling out his phone. The first stone had been cast. The ripples began to spread. The third and final blow was personal. Zora found Mrs. Yu near a sculpture exhibit, trying to compose herself. Zora walked right up to her, invading her personal space, just as Mrs. Yu had done in the parking lot. "You know," Zora began, her voice a soft murmur, "you said my hair was like wire." Mrs. Yu flinched, speechless. "You were right," Zora continued, leaning in closer. "It is. Strong enough to build a cage, and the door just locked." At that exact moment, a collective gasp went through the room. Phones were buzzing, lighting up faces with the blue glow of disaster. The news story had just broken. The financial alerts were pinging. Yu Tai-woo. Assets frozen. Pending trafficking investigation. It was a public execution. The whispers grew into a roar. Yu Tai-woo stood alone, his face a mask of disbelief as his allies and partners melted away into the crowd. His empire had vanished in the space of a single news alert. Mrs. Yu stared at Zora, her face crumbling. The cruelty, the arrogance, it all dissolved into pathetic, pleading terror. "Please," she whispered, grabbing Zora's arm. The same arm she had seen scalded. "Please, you can stop this. I'll give you anything." Zora looked down at the woman's manicured hand on her silk sleeve. She didn't pull away. She simply held the woman's gaze, her own eyes devoid of pity. "I already have everything I need," she said, her voice cold as a grave. She gently removed Mrs. Yu's hand from her arm and turned, walking away without a backward glance. She met Min Jun by the exit. He said nothing, but his eyes conveyed it all: respect, acknowledgement, partnership. Outside, the first police cars were arriving, their lights flashing silently against the museum's glass facade. They were the cleanup crew, arriving long after the battle had been won. 3 months later, the air at the port of Busan smelled of salt, diesel, and commerce. Zora stood on a gantry overlooking a massive container ship, a tablet in her hand. She wore practical tailored trousers and a warm jacket. The golden dragon pin, a subtle gleam on her collar. The wind whipped loose strands of her braids across her face, but she didn't notice. Her focus was absolute. She was not sitting in a cushy office. She was on the front lines, managing the logistics of the Golden Dragon Syndicate's legitimate import-export business. She was doing the work. "The security seals on these containers are outdated," she spoke in crisp Korean to the port supervisor standing beside her. "The V5 model can be bypassed with a magnetic pulse. We need to upgrade the entire fleet to the V9S with biometric locks. I've already sourced a supplier." The supervisor, a grizzled man who had worked for Abeoji for 30 years, nodded in deference. "Yes, ma'am, right away." He saw her not as the old boss's pet, but as a commander. She had earned her authority not through her name, but through her competence. Later that day, she visited Halmeoni. The new treatment, paid for with the first check from her new position, was working. Her grandmother was sitting in a sun-drenched garden, painting watercolors, her face full of life. She had her color back. This was the true victory. That evening, Zora was back on the docks, watching the evening shift load the last of the cargo. The lights of the port glittered on the dark water. It was a brutal, beautiful, and honest place. Min Jun appeared beside her, a silent presence in the bustling noise of the port. He handed her a steaming mug of tea. It was barley tea, the kind Abeoji used to drink. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the complex dance of men and machines. "The board approved the security upgrade," he said finally, unanimously. "You found a vulnerability my father's best men missed for a decade." "I just see things differently," Zora said, taking a sip of the warm tea. He looked out at the sprawling operation, the source of their family's power, its past stained with darkness, its future uncertain. "You see things I don't," he stated. It wasn't just praise. It was a confession. It was recognition. In his world, it was the purest declaration of love he was capable of giving. Zora looked from the container ships to the city skyline beyond. She was the daughter of diplomats, the adopted child of a crime lord, a waitress, a strategist, a commander. She was a bridge between worlds, and she had fought for her place in this one. She had endured the wound, reversed the power, and delivered her own justice. She was no longer invisible. She was home. What would you have done? If you enjoyed this story of justice and earned triumph, like and subscribe for more.